Hello, everyone. My name is Nolen Johnson, and this is Jan Altensen, and today we're going to be talking about fault injection and the supply chain. So first, let's talk about ourselves a little bit. My name is Nolen Johnson. I've got 7 years of experience in the mobile and IoT and /embedded, people like that buzzword, development and security testing space. I also do a significant amount of work in IT and OT convergence, so network security, convergence, and governance. And then lastly, started in my free time, has been adopted by the day job, security research. I've got 4 higher critical CVEs, the Lineage OS Developer Relations Manager on the open source side, and then day job, I'm a hardware and enterprise security consultant at Direct Defense's Connected Systems Division.
My name is Jan Altensen. For the past 7 years, I've been working on Android systems, mainly BSP side. I have 3 CVs to my name currently. In my free time, I do security research, and my day job is Android.
And of the exploit we're going to be showing a little bit later, a third contributor named Ray Volp did contribute. Shout-outs, definitely. He decided he wouldn't come along for the talk. So first, let's talk about what fault injection is, right? Maybe enlighten some people. So now what's funny enough is that actually is fault injection. Shorting PCI lanes would in fact be a form of fault injection, right? So it really surrounds how systems behave when you mistreat them, when they're stressed in unusual ways. Really anything that you do that would be out of spec, the manufacturer would frown at, or is just plain unreasonable, such as that, would be considered fault injection, right? And so they're usually notoriously hard to exploit reliably. Some of these methods we'll talk about later can be affected by things like UV light, environmental conditions, and electrical interference, which means that recreating these, especially in the demo you're going to see later, or hopefully going to see, considering all those factors, it can be really, really tough. It usually requires physical access, and so what this generates for most people is what practical use does this actually have? And we'll talk about that. So first, let's talk through the types of fault injection, right? So the 5 main types were defined by IEC. Thankfully, now we don't have to use our words for it. We can use theirs. So pin-level injection is the most common. That's going to be anything relating to physically touching the board, shorting things, etc. Specifically, the type we're going to be talking about today and diving into is storage-based. Next is electromagnetic injection. So think automotive and avionics, right? Planes have to deal with a lot of strange stuff that normal technologies don't. Think burst generators for testing that, and then IEC 801-4 for actually remediating those issues. Power supply injection. A lot of you have probably heard about this in the crypto space recently, right? So this is what you might hear as voltage-based, some people refer to. Glitching microprocessors and small devices. Think hardware wallets, right? You've probably seen the YouTube videos, I cracked the hardware wallet and made $3 million, right? That is a form of fault injection, and that is one of the uses of, this type of attack. Radiation-based, I'll be honest, this is black magic. Bit flips caused by ionizing particles. I have seen a setup where someone pointed a laser at a CPU to actually introduce fault. Not going to pretend that I could demo that on stage or talk through that one all that well. And then lastly, this is the one that y'all are probably most familiar with, right? So test port based. This is going to be anything over UART, JTAG, software debug, really anything that relates to manipulation of hardware registers from an intended perspective in unintended ways, right? So let's talk storage-based fault injection, and credits to my friend Sean with a very nice microscope for getting an actual shot of the Chromecast's eMMC. So it is a type of pin-level fault injection. It involves physically removing or shorting a device's internal storage at a strategic time. Some devices do really interesting things, but most devices are just going to panic, right? If you have your laptop, your desktop computer, and you rip the hard drive out at a strategic time and boot, you don't get anything interesting. It just reboots, resets, right? But some devices have really interesting behavior when manufacturers and chipset developers don't properly account for that sort of behavior. It's very, very easy to fry devices in the course of both testing, developing, and then executing these. We've gone through probably 3 or 4 Chromecasts in the development of this chain, and the Pixel tablet dock you see there that we'll talk about later as well. Well, actually, the only one we killed, we didn't kill. Teamstar did. So I give him a huge thank you for that one. Yeah, okay, so there was a second one that died as well. But shout-outs where shout-outs are due. So first, let's say enter the Chromecast, right? This is kind of the target we're going to be talking about today. Two models. There's the 4K one, codenamed Sabrina, and the 1080p one, codenamed Boreal. You can look at the price points here, and other than the 4K model's price difference from USD to Euro, it's a pretty good deal. A lot of people have them, obviously, 30 million active devices, and that's just for the Chromecast with Google TV. That doesn't account for the older Chromecasts that are often still Amlogic based. So to give a little bit of preface, 2021, we created Sabrina Unlock, which is uses Frederick Bosson. A lot of you have probably used his work. His boot ROM exploit to just simply boot a custom bootloader and set the lock variable on the device to bypass secure boot. I'm not going to dive into that too much, but just the idea that I wanted to explain here is that it was far simpler back then. Google has accounted for that and made it much harder to do things, even when you have that level of access. So we've already hit Sabrina, so let's hit Boreal, the new one. So I'll let Jan talk about the security model of Android.
So on Android, you start with secure boot, which ensures cryptographic signed code execution up to the bootloader. Afterwards, you have something that's called Android verified boot, which ensures that all critical partitions are, again, cryptographically signed and verified. Afterwards, you have something that's called the Verity, which is a kernel feature, again, for integrity checks. Afterwards, you have something that's called SE Linux, or Security Enhanced Linux, which is being used for mandatory access control. You also have, additionally, file-based encryption for the user data. And for Boreal, specifically, Google introduced something we call forced lock. We will talk about the forced lock a little bit later.
Okay. So kind of moving forward through that. So let's talk about getting a foot in the door, right? Getting a start, and talking about the fault injection that we alluded to earlier. So this is a video of it being performed in the most reliable way possible. So U-boot has a variable called the boot delay. Many of you are likely familiar with this. If you're not familiar with U-boot, it is ostensibly one of the most used bootloaders in the world. And if you're not familiar with the term bootloader, it's what loads everything before the operating system, right? It brings up hardware, it deals with security features, and then the kernel and the OS is loaded by proxy, right? So U-boot has a variable called boot delay that dictates how long the device waits over serial connectivity for you to interrupt it to configure different things, boot different kernels, etc., right? On the Chromecast line of devices, it's either set to -1 or -2. Both just imply in slightly different ways that there is no delay for you to actually interrupt over serial. So no matter how many times you spam the enter button over serial, you're not going to get it interrupted, you're not going to get access to U-boot shell. However, if we strategically short storage at the proper time in the boot sequence, the device will hang, and we actually create our own boot delay. And that's what we're going to be demonstrating a bit later. So realistically, the kind of important takeaway here is by strategically shorting it at the correct time, we discovered that you can interrupt the boot flow and execute U-boot shell commands as the bootloader. And so I'll talk a little bit about the initial research once we had access. So now that we have access to U-boot, what can we do, right? So first, I'll kind of briefly talk through the force lock bit that Jan mentioned earlier. Force lock just dictates that even if you go set that lock variable by hand to disable security checks, right, it's not going to actually let you. It's just going to spam over shell. This device is force locked. Great job on Google's part. It's a build time check that we really can't bypass. I know some people will say, well, you could probably just use memory overriding tools from U-boot to do some modification of that check. And you could, but we'll explain why we didn't want to go that route a little bit later. So to talk about the initial research now that we're here and we can't do it the easy way, right? We take a look at how the device is locked. So this is the lock data struct. The short of it and the only really important bits are that there's anti-rollback. Can the device be unlocked, and is it currently locked? And really those just boil down to, can we ignore signature checks if we choose to? And are signature checks enforced at the moment? So now let's take a look and see what decides whether the device is unlocked, right? So we take a look at some snippets of code. Is the device a developer variant? Okay, well, if it's not, we're going to go ahead and say the device is force locked, like we said. I will say, you dive a little bit deeper down. This is kind of where the research kind of starts. So you dive down and say, what checks if, the board variant is development, right? So we take a look and say that if the root certificate of this specific fuse reads out 0, it's development. If the device is fused with any value, it's production. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit further what checks that fuse. Unfortunately, it's the secure world. So with it being a secure world check, we would need a whole chain of very, very expensive per the last, about probably the $3 or $4 million tier of the last presentation. So definitely not something we can just get our hands on, not something we really have time to dive into for the sake of this effort. So from that perspective, just kind of getting an idea that the security model is built really well. Google's done a great job of building it out, and then I'll let Jan talk about the actual bypass mechanism.
So interestingly enough, when you look at the Android verified boot code of the bootloader that's used on the Boreal, you will see that by standard, by default, there is a way to bypass AVB when you unlock the bootloader. Unfortunately for Google, the SoC vendor Amlogic introduced another way to bypass it. The way they did it is they have an additional environment variable that is called upgrade step. If you set it to 3, it does not matter if you unlocked or locked. It will just bypass AVB and allow any signature to load and execute.
Yeah, and so to kind of add to that one a little bit, we put the relevant snippet of code here. You're diving through. Some of you are smirking, and you can touch because some of you might see it already. At the very end there, you'll see if upgrade step's 3, everything's okay, right? And so everything is not in fact okay. And the scary part here is it doesn't just put it into a yellow state. Android verified boot has green, good, yellow. You're self-signed, red, you're not signed, right? And it doesn't even put it into yellow. It refers to itself as green and fully secure, which is terrifying. Yes. And the reason behind this is that Amlogic wanted to prevent issues during over-the-air updates with people power cycling devices. So if you had a power failure, that's what this was put there to handle. And unfortunately, it's extremely misusable. So realistically, we thought it must be more complex than that, right? So we set the environment variable, and no, it is that easy. So we made some patches to the kernel live. I won't waste your time talking about those. They're publicly findable. And booted it right up. We have root at the local level. But now, just as we were talking about, or as Fred was talking about in the previous presentation, right, persistence is key. When we reboot, all those checks are going to be checked again. And, well, this is kind of useless, right? What would be the use of something like this? Well, so we have tethered access, but we still have to perform the fault injection each boot. Enter the bootloader control block, which the short of it is it's in the MISC partition on Android. It is used to pass boot reason. So when you reboot to factory reset your device, right, when you reboot to recovery or to safe mode, a little bit of data is written there that tells the running bootloader what it is intended to do upon reboot. It's persistent command execution. But it isn't sanitized whatsoever. So we can stuff whatever we want in there, and it is interpreted as a uboot shell command. So in short, we basically take the upgrade step variable and stuff it into the MISC partition as a setenv command. And upon reboot, that's the first thing that will be executed. So it's a self-owning loop. And now some people might say, well, that's a bit finicky. You could reboot and clear that accidentally, right? You could issue a reboot reason and it would clear that. There is some black magic that is still not remediated, so I will not be talking about it today. But the black magic allows you to have that string rewrite itself at the uboot level. So the short of it is, once you've done it once, it is persistent, it is there forever, you're good to go. Additionally, you can also write an init script in the boot image, and because verified boot is in a self-pwning circle, it will rewrite itself, which is what the demo that we have today has set up. And again, that's a really mostly resilient root access method. And not just that, you have uboot shell as well, so if you want to do something more nefarious, you totally can. But root access was kind of the demo we wanted to talk about. We're not going to install spyware and demo keyloggers, but last presentation talked about that well enough. So I will let Jan talk about mitigations.
But before we start with the mitigations, the screenshot you see is the actual code change. Amlogic introduced the AVB bypass. We found the commit on GitHub, which is funny. Mm-hmm. For mitigations, one of the first things is review the code you get from your vendors. It's the first thing you should do. For the fault injection, proper error handling, instead of just falling back to the uboot shell or hanging or whatever. Ideally, reboot the device. for the BCB commands, you should whitelist or lowlist these commands. Interestingly, Amlogic, later on, we discovered that while researching a little bit, that they, in the newer U-boot release version of them, they have a low list of them. They have a fixed list of stuff that is allowed and what is not allowed. But when you have an older release, you can just still set in there whatever you want. Also, pretty much all Amlogic devices are vulnerable to this, regardless if it's eMMC, NAND chip, or whatever. You will most likely will be able to get the U-boot shell.
Yeah, so to kind of elaborate on that just a little bit, when he says almost all Amlogic devices are vulnerable, we're going to kind of dive into that here to talk about vulnerable devices and what they look like, right? So 30 million Chromecasts with Google TVs that are vulnerable to this. When we worked with Google to triage this issue, we initially thought that all three of these bugs were Google specific. The first one turned out to be specific to Amlogic. Other vendors do have forms of eMMC fault injection. You see the MediaTek logo up there. You can, on MediaTek devices, short the eMMC to get into special boot modes where, God knows MediaTek has how many boot round vulnerabilities that are public at this point. So you can fall back and then use those older vulnerabilities. Broadcom is also known to be notoriously vulnerable to this sort of attack. But from the Google side specifically, we're looking at not really just the Chromecast, all of the Nest Hubs, the Nest Hub Minis, the speakers, the smart displays. More recently, the Pixel Tablet dock, which we will actually be demoing for you today, and the Nest Wi-Fi Pro, which some of our colleagues at hardware.io proof of concepted that it works there as well. Realistically, what this implies is that just for rough numbers, about 100 million Amlogic devices are vulnerable to the eMMC fault injection that we're talking about today. The upgrade step in BCB bugs were patched in December of 2023. Realistically, with how often vendors pull code from their upstream, most devices in that number are not going to be patched to these vulnerabilities, right? So, kind of with that in mind, one of the mitigations Jan was talking about, review code from your vendors. Also, make sure you have the newest code from your vendors, right? Grabbing the board support package when you start working on the product and then never touching firmware again is no longer an okay practice. Not that it ever was, but, it was kind of the default action for a long time. So yeah, likely other chipsets are vulnerable as well. I would definitely challenge people to go out and take some development boards they have of different chipsets and see if you can find the eMMC traces, and then see what happens when you short out the device, right? And I will warn you, you'll smoke devices. Do it with rubber gloves. You'll see balls of spark every now and then, but it's definitely worth it to try, right? So let's tie this all back to the core of the presentation, right? The supply chain part. So people might say, how does this affect me? So let's talk about how it affects you, and then we'll separately talk about how it affects business, right? So how it affects you. Really, when you're looking at supply chain side attacks, there are three sort of inline methods that you're supposed to use to remediate that threat vector, right? Trust, validate, verify. Okay. Trusting your vendors do the right thing does not mean I trust you, you can have my phone, right? It means that you're checking their security certs. You're checking to see what their processes are, right? From the validation side, you're checking that they're actually doing what they say they're doing, right? So, you're checking that they are pulling those releases from their vendor. You're checking everything that you can. And then lastly, checking from a personal perspective comes down to, is the seal on the box of the product that I have bought actually intact, right? Because almost all vendors nowadays are putting some sort of seal to see whether the device has been opened or not. Taking a look at that is critical. Not buying from the third party and aftermarket. eBay and Alibaba are notoriously kind of problematic in this area, and we'll get into that a little bit later. From an enterprise side, realistically, it almost strictly means working on trusting and validating your vendors, because again, you can't really verify. And that's kind of the piece I left out of the personal bit. We used to be able to say, verify it. Go see if the device actually enforces secure boot. See if it actually has signed data, right? If the partitions are all signed. But I can tell you offhand that when you buy a Chromecast, how are you going to verify that secure boot's enforced, that it's actually, these checks are being run? You're going to pop it open and hook UART up to it and check. And even then, you may not notice that this one variable is being self-written. I mean, who is going to check for that specific of a piece? They're just going to see that verified. You may go to the point of saying, verified boot is green, therefore I'm good, right? Because one would make the assumption. The problem is, this is not the only vulnerability like this. Some of our other colleagues have found 2 or 3 very similar bugs that are in the process of being reported. So really the idea here, and it's not just in Google products. We chose Google products. It's the high name, to talk about. But a lot of other products have these issues. So really it comes down to enforcing your trust and enforcing your validation tactics, security certs, and validating everything you can from your vendors. And from a product development side, as Jan heavily alluded to, verify code from all of your vendors, right? So we're going to be reviewing everything you get, right? So you might assume that the base U-boot from Amlogic is just fine to use. Check it. It doesn't have to be necessarily in-depth. I can tell you offhand, it took us a while to find this, but for most people who are sitting and looking at the verified boot function for long enough, they will, anyone with a slightly technical mind will see, hey, that looks problematic. What does that do? And you may not be able to run with that and find the injection vector, but, like Fred talked about in the previous presentation, you can just buy an injection vector in some cases. Those are going to be the mitigations from the product side, the enterprise side, and the personal side. Let's talk about a few supply chain nightmares. Now, this GIF is funny, of course, but the funnier part is it's floating downstream. So it is floating to your business, right? That's kind of the idea. Let's talk about the biggest one I found recently. A few months ago, Linus Tech Tips released an editorial on Android TVs with malware and spyware. They bought 10 different Android TV no-names off of random platforms, eBay, AliExpress, Alibaba, etc. 9 out of 10 of them were discovered to have keyloggers, spyware, and the likes, right? Which is terrifying. One of them was discovered to just have just a small function that exported data. Exported data and not just data, audio from the microphone on the remote. So nothing too huge, right? So now let's talk about a few personal experiences. The IT company I worked for many moons ago bought some network hardware for 24% off. Sounds like a great deal. It's used, right? They got it off of eBay. I was against this practice, but they did it. And that went into an environment, obviously can't say which, but an environment you probably wouldn't want this to happen in. And the short of it is, it worked great for about 4 years before we went to do a major version upgrade it was Cisco hardware, to be fair, or to be candid. The short of it is, after 4 years, we went to go do a major version upgrade, not just security patching. And turns out it's not genuine hardware. The update said, nope, sorry, you're not genuine, therefore we're not going to update. Some of them tried to update and just bricked. And at the time, they thought, oh man, we sold bad product. My brain went, oh dear God. Uh-oh, right? So I tore the thing open and worked with some Cisco techs to look at the boards themselves, and they said those aren't even remotely close to our board layouts. We have no clue what half those components are. Great, right? That's terrifying. So that was lesson number 1, and that was in 2013. So this has been happening for a long time, again, like Fred said. In the more recent side, engineering phones from eBay and the aftermarket, right? So I bought, for Lineage OS, frequently have to buy phones to support them under Lineage OS. On this as well, we have probably a stack of 30 or 40 devices in a box at home. Yeah, too many. But So we buy devices, as cheap as we can because we're just trying to support them. One of the devices I bought recently actually came to me in an engineering state, which is Fuse that's supposed to be written when it comes out of the factory. So this has had fault injection or some sort of vulnerability executed to put it in engineering mode. And it had a completely custom and unsigned modem firmware, the cellular modem, which is just terrifying. From my perspective, however, I will say that is the dream. It enforces no secure boot checks, and I can do all of the debugging on that device that I want. So I buy from that vendor. Now I have a great relationship with that vendor. But what kills me is last time he sent me a normal phone new in box. And so I had to message him and say, hey, that's not why I buy from you. Can I get one of the sketchy ones? He did not respond to that query. But yeah, to kind of tie that all together, targeted versus wide net attacks. Wide net attacks are eBay, AliExpress, etc., the third-party market. Be wary of buying devices that are cheaper than they should be. Be wary of buying devices that have, that are aftermarket, that are third-party, right? And then the targeted attack side. If you receive a box with a Chromecast in it from an Amazon box that has, a note in it that says, from great Aunt Kathy, I thought you'd enjoy this, right? You're not really, depending on the relative and the connection to them, and if enough social engineering is done beforehand, you might not question it. I have several cousins and friends that would send me stuff for my birthday for other things, right? So I receive a Chromecast in a box and I go, oh, awesome. I hook it into my, my girlfriend's office TV. I've got an NVIDIA Shield I'm more than happy with, but I hook it into my girlfriend's office TV and fault injection, local root access shell, and just tracing off the audio from the in-remote microphone, and suddenly we have a nice little spyware device in our house. And you might say to yourself, I would never trust that, right? I would never take something out of a box from a relative without verifying it with them, but a lot of people would, right? The less security conscious would just say, oh, awesome. Just like the old Stuxnet, throw a fistful of USBs over the fence and someone will plug one in. Very similar idea, right? And so, we talked a lot about how to mitigate these threats, and, you really can't stress it enough. Trust and validate because you cannot verify. And then, really lastly, from a business perspective, not buying third party. And if you are going to buy third party, work with the vendor. Like if you contact the likes of Cisco or the larger vendors, Fortinet, et cetera, and you say, hey, I suspect, I bought my hardware from the third party, I'd like to verify. Some of them now have validation tactics. Board photos that you can compare, component listings, software you can run that verifies to the best of their ability. And although these aren't foolproof, they're good measures for everyone to take to start looking at that. And more vendors have these tool sets nowadays that you can actually go get and verify yourself. So that kind of covers most of the supply chain side. So now for the fun stuff, demonstrations or demolitions, depending on how this goes. Because like I said, ball of sparks is a thing that happens sometimes. So I will, let me get this pulled down here just so I can get the USB hub plugged in. We're going to be demonstrating on camera 2 of the vulnerable devices. For the sake of brevity, we are just really going to be focusing on exploitation of fault injection. We are not going to be hitting, I'll figure this out. We're not going to be hitting, I'll just leave that there. We're not going to be hitting anything on the root access or anything on that side. We're just going to be demoing the fault injection side. So give me just one moment. While we're doing this, we could actually save some time, because I know we're a bit behind from Fred's, and do some questions while I hook this up. Perfect, yeah. So if we want to do any questions while I hook this up, if anyone has any questions. Good. And then we are in just the USB hub, and we can go. Okay, so I'll go ahead and escape out of the presentation and pop over. So first, we are going to be demoing it on the Google Chromecast. You have to. What was that? Oh, is it not up? No. Why are we not up? Let's see. Did it just come loose? There we go. Apologies about that. Yep. Perfect. So with that said, we're going to be, can everyone see? Here, let me get camera. Is it cute? Perfect. All right. So now everyone can see the boards, at least to some extent. And next to it, you see the serial terminal for the relevant device. So first, we're going to be performing this on the Chromecast. I'm just going to be speaking loud, so I have both hands here. But in short, we're going to be hooking up UART to both using a PC byte kit. So RX and TX are set. We are on the same power circuit, so I will not be grounding. I know some of you are going to be looking at me a little funny about that. I've done this a lot. Don't worry about it. And plus, I've smoked enough devices, it doesn't matter. So short, we're going to be grounding this pin. And we're going to first just check that we get logs out of... Yep. So this is a boot log via UART. Now we're going to go ahead and short the pin that is relevant. Camera died? Great. There we go. It just wasn't selected. All right. So with that said, let me get this set up. One moment. The PC byte kits are fantastic, and they prevent causing damage to boards. But I will say sometimes getting the needles properly set can be a bit of a pain. Get the grounding pin set, and then check that we have output once more. Yep. And now we're good to go. This can be a bit temperamental. It usually takes 3 or 4 tries. With something like a PyPico, which actually Teamstar has mentioned he's working on for this exact exploit, you could dilute this down to timing and actually get it set up and automated. We were hoping to have that done before the presentation, but of course, time constraints are as time constraints are. So as you'll see, some of the errors that are coming up are eMMC-related errors. They're just not exactly what we're hoping for. We'll get it here shortly. You know what? I will pivot and we'll do the tablet doc first. Should have done that to begin with. It can happen. These are temperamental, and like I mentioned, things like light can affect these in some cases, and some interference or any sort of electrical interference. So what we'll be demoing here, there we go. Go ahead, you can explain.
I do have 2 buttons here. One is a reset line, the other one is to short the eMMC at the NAND chip. So I will reset the board, and then hopefully we get a new watch shot.
First try.
There we are.
All right, there we go. Yeah, and so I would love to show you the persistence bugs that we have set up for Corlin, the Pixel tablet dock as well, but I can tell you that Google agreed that we could present the fault injection bit, but they did not have remediated in time for the presentation the remainder of the stack. So I can't show the persistence bit for the Pixel tablet dock, just know it's a completely different chain of 2 additional exploits to gain the exact same access we had in the Chromecast. So with that said, I won't waste time sitting here and poking at the Chromecast more. Just know, we had a few people at hardware.io, a few people that had never done hardware-based attacks performing it within about maybe 5-10 minutes of practice. I really think that just about anybody in this room could get it with enough practice and maybe with a little bit less caffeine than I currently have in my system. So with that, any questions about anything that we've talked about today or anything in that realm? Was there a question someone's walking back to or no? Oh, yeah, okay, there's one. Hello?
Yes, you can hear me. I have a question about when you get to the U-boot shell.
Correct.
And a lot of devices, they actually give you the U-boot shell.
Correct.
But then if you try to load some software, they will check that it's signed properly.
Correct.
So you can set environment variables, but if you don't have any vulnerabilities there, even if you glitch yourself into a U-boot shell, you might still not be able to do anything.
So, actually, Sabrina is a great example for this, right? So, when you perform this on the 4K Chromecast, there is no mitigation to setting an environment variable and saving the environment. And most devices actually, I say most, this is definitely personal experience, this is not from any statistic. Most of the devices I've worked with let you write the environment partition, meaning you can change those variables, right? So you could change the lock variable by hand yourself. On Boreal and on newer devices, really only Google is the only vendor I've seen get smart enough to do it, a build time force lock, like we demonstrated. But yes, there are cases where you'll hit, like Boreal fully patched now. There is another chain we have in progress that maybe we'll be talking about next year here, at the rate it's moving currently. But the short of it is, there are devices where that level of access won't really help. But what it can help is further security research. So what we can do, one thing we demonstrated very early on with the Chromecast is that before we had the rest of the persistence chain, you could write to U-boot in memory, make modifications to U-boot's code, and then re-jump to U-boot. Again, thanks to Teamstar for talking us through some of the logistics on that and helping us debug the nonsense that came along with it. But the short of it is you can modify the bootloader to your will, right? You can put shellcode into memory and really do whatever you want. And that is very temporary. It is single boot, but from a research perspective, it's invaluable to dive in deeper and finding those other bugs. Also, massive call out to companies that actually respect the GPL license and give you the source code for U-boot. Google's really good about it. Not everyone is. So that's one of the reasons Google devices are targeted. Any other questions? we got one more.
How did you decide to apply this fault model? Why did you do it this way? Why did you do this type of fault injection? Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What kind of analysis did you do before that?
Apologies, can you repeat that?
What kind of analysis did you do to decide to apply this fault model on this device?
Yes. So
Where to fault, how to fault, what to fault.
Definitely, right? This came largely about twofold. One, I work on MediaTek devices a significant amount at work. And there's, I'll give the 2-minute version of this. It is MediaTek has BROM mode, a USB download mode. It is properly protectable by kind of locking out access to it. We worked with a client to help them remediate access to that mode because it's vulnerable to about 7 different vulnerabilities right now that let you do full remote code access or remote code execution. The short of it, we figured out that if you short the eMMC, and this was just totally by incident, it was an idea, it was saying, well, if there's no storage medium, will it fall back to some download mode? And so that's where it started, was just holding and shorting the eMMC, right? And then my brain kind of went, okay, well, where can we go with that, right? What other devices might have similar modes? And sure enough, on Amlogic, it will actually give you boot ROM mode. Google's smart enough to put a password on that, so we kind of got a bit stuck there. The third contributor, Ray Volp, actually, I wish he was here to answer it, is the one that actually plugged it together to say, okay, no, we're not going to short it at device start. We're going to short it at a strategic time. And the timing for that was a genuine nightmare when we first got it set up. And as you can see by the shaky hands preventing it today. But yeah, so it's largely previous experience. There are other types of fault injection, though, that are being looked into. We talked about artificially creating that delay. Heat and supercooling of your CPU can cause different timings than are expected. And again, that might be a topic for next year's talk. Anyone else? Awesome. And then the last little bit I wanted to go with, I work at Direct Defense. We're a security corporation that does OT and IT convergence and governance, IoT, mobile and embedded testing. And then lastly, your IEC and ISO certifications of the world. So if anyone wants to come talk to me afterwards, or you have a question about the presentation that you couldn't put words to at that moment, feel free to come find me afterwards.